Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to my channel, Analyze This Mr. Bond, where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. There's a new Bond film lurking on the horizon. Amazon is working on it, with producers David Heyman and Amy Pascal. But the question remains, after No Time to Die left the series in a period of limbo, having killed off Daniel Craig's version of James Bond, what comes next? Obviously, the series has to reset itself much as it did in 2006 with Casino Royale, and the question remains, what will the inspiration be for this next version of Bond? The former producers of the Bond series, Eon Productions with Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson, always looked to Fleming in periods of indecision about the direction of the franchise. And I happen to have been digging into the Fleming novels. I was starting to rework my way through them at the beginning of this year, long before anything happened with the Amazon news. And I think I've found the answer. The answer is Moonraker. Those of you who haven't read Moonraker may raise an eyebrow. The book Moonraker is very little like the film of the same name. In fact, I would go as far as to say as the book is practically unadapted at this point. If you were to do a faithful adaptation of Ian Fleming's Moonraker, it would be like no Bond film we've seen. No film has captured the story elements. And Ian Fleming's Moonraker really would set an excellent foundation for Bond 26. It has such a strong, clear grasp of the Bond character, his world, and the kinds of threats he should face. And I think it maps on neatly to what the Bond series can be going forward. So first, let's sum up the big differences between the movie Moonraker and the book Moonraker, since I assume many of you are more familiar with the film, in which Roger Moore's James Bond goes to outer space to stop a madman from creating a genetic master race and destroying everyone left on Earth. Ian Fleming's Moonraker is very, very different from the film. It begins when Bond is between assignments. One of the great virtues of Moonraker is that it gives us a sense of who Bond is when he's off duty. What does his daily routine look like? How does he feel about living in London? What is his salary? His hobbies, such as his enthusiasm for automobiles or playing cards. All of those details are baked into this story. We get such wonderful glimpses into Bond's mind. In fact, Bond is so convinced that he will die by his early to mid 40s that he's really trying to spend all his money as soon as it comes in. He is a character who is really expecting that his life is going to end at any moment, and he's really living it up in London as he waits for the excitement of a new assignment. So we find him in the shooting gallery down in the basement of MI6, performing target practice, and M calls him in for a personal favor. In fact, M sits him down and calls him James instead of 007, and that personal touch takes Bond aback. M, in his privileged social circles, has brushed shoulders with a character named Sir Hugo Drax. Sir Hugo Drax is a World War II veteran, a man who was injured during World War II. He has a scarred face, but came back and turned into an incredible businessman, a man of incredible ambition who has now decided to gift the British government with a missile that can secure its future in the nuclear age, the Moonraker. The problem, though, is that Hugo Drax risks scandal. He's a national hero, but he's putting his reputation at risk by cheating at cards. And M would prefer to avoid any scandal. He doesn't want Hugo Drax's reputation to be tarnished, given that the Moonraker's test launch is right around the corner. So he asks Bond, the best card player in the service, to come with him to his gentleman's club and try to figure out how to solve this problem. And thus begins Moonraker. Bond goes with M to his gentleman's club. You get a great sense for his relationship with M, as well as Bond's own intelligence, as he catches Hugo Drax at cheating and figures out how to turn it against Drax, to teach him a lesson politely without alerting anyone around that Drax has been cheating. It's a great glimpse into Bond, the sort of reckless, risk-seeking individual who is a little bit too arrogant for his own good, but somehow makes it just across the finish line. This is a character who, when he's having dinner with M, decides that he needs to seem a little drunk so that Drax won't see him as a threat in the card game, but then also spikes his drink with Benzedrine to keep him on edge. Bond subsequently regrets this midway through the match as he feels a little bit too feverish and nauseous for his own good, but that's a perfect glimpse into the Bond character, this character who is just willing to push his luck a little too far, but somehow manages to eke out a win as he does turn the tables against Drax, and Drax is furious. In the aftermath of this event, with Bond having won a great sum of money at Drax's expense, there's an incident at the Moonraker test facility. Bond is called in to investigate. Bond starts to develop feelings for his equal number in the police force working as an insider on the Moonraker site. Her name's Gala Brand, and Bond and Gala develop a tight working relationship. She's the person who is checking the trajectory of the missile in the build-up to its test flight, so she's intimately involved with the operations of the Moonraker, and together they uncover a scheme. It turns out that Hugo Drax is actually a Nazi. During the war, when he was disfigured, he was mistaken for a British soldier and has been plotting revenge against Britain this whole time. He intends to fire the missile with an active payload and destroy London. Gala and Bond turn the tides against Drax. The missile is diverted, Drax is destroyed, and Bond saves the day. Certain elements of that story were loosely used as a framework for Die Another Day. Die Another Day in earlier drafts was much closer to Moonraker as a story. In fact, Rosamund Pike's character was actually named Gala Brand in earlier drafts of Die Another Day, but those story elements have mostly remained unused. And that makes a good case for it just to be adapted on its own merits. But the reason it really feels like a perfect choice for the next Bond movie is its strong sense of who Bond is, how he exists in the world, how he thinks, how he behaves. When introducing a new version of Bond, especially in the wake of an iteration of Bond that had a full start and end, it makes sense to begin with a story that really has a strong grasp of the character. And I would argue that of all of Fleming's novels, Moonraker is the one where his sense of Bond's characterization really comes into its own. Bond may be fully formed in the first Bond novel, Casino Royale, but the level of detail with which Fleming starts to describe Bond here, the level of intelligence with which he describes Bond's thoughts, the way he describes Bond's behavioral patterns, it's all much more specific in Moonraker. And what a lovely way to subvert audience expectations a bit. You could have an exciting pre-title sequence and then immediately launch into this wonderful section of the film where we really get to experience what Bond's life is like in downtime. We've never really gotten to experience that in a Bond movie before. We've seen glimpses of Bond's home, but it's always very brief right before he leaps into a new adventure. To get a sense of what Bond's life is like at his workplace, in his personal time, visiting the mechanic who's taking care of Bond's beloved vintage automobile, or playing cards for the evening, or chatting with the MI6 staff as he waits for a new assignment. All of that could be a lovely setup for an unexpected version of the Bond M briefing scene where M asks Bond for a personal favor. It's a true mission, but it starts with a very personal setup, and it immediately gets Bond into the mix with a villain Bond's mission is initially just to stop a bit of public scandal in the world with which he's already comfortable. Bond is an avid card player. He loves gambling. So this is a perfect opportunity to introduce the character into that world in a slightly more intimate framework. This immediately pits Bond against the villain of the story, and from there, things can begin to unfold organically. I would say if Ian Fleming's Moonraker has a weakness, it's that after that initial wonderful setup with Bond playing cards against the villain, humiliating the villain, and winning a lot of money at the villain's expense, the actual core mystery of the story is a little bit weak. Fleming is not a great mystery plotter, and you see that here. The detective story elements are not very strong, but this idea of Bond being called in to investigate something that's of great national security that involves this same villain that he's humiliated before. What a wonderful dynamic. The sort of tension there between them, it sets things off on the right foot. And to have Bond's female counterpart be directly engaged with the mission. In fact, Galibrand, as characterized here, obviously a characterization of its time, limited by Fleming's own limited imagination for how women think and feel, is still a lot more active and engaged in the story than the prior heroines of Fleming's previous novels. You really see Fleming stretch himself as the books go on to think of new ways to characterize the people in Bond's life, and Galibrand is a step forward here as she's very actively involved in Bond's investigation. In fact, it's her that saves the day in the story, and so you have this wonderful partnership that you can build on as you build this story arc. And the Moonraker threat itself may be old hat now. Nuclear missiles are not an exciting, novel territory in the world of 2025, but there's no shortage of technological developments that put the world at risk today. In fact, we live in a world where things like Neuralink are an active part of the cultural conversation. We live in an age where science fiction is reality, so all you need to do is transpose the concept of the Moonraker onto some new superweapon that is being used in Britain's defense or in the defense of the Western world, and Bond has all the imperative in the world to safeguard it. That creates a terrific, easy setup for the Bond film, complete with a villain whose duplicitous intent is anchored in a world where businessmen are more powerful than ever. In fact, the role of the celebrity businessman has been transformed over time. It's something that's baked into the DNA of the Bond series. It really originates here. The villains before this in the Fleming novels were not that businessman archetype, but it became the standard Bond villain archetype. You know, think of Elliot Carver, think of Goldfinger. It's time to see that version of a Bond villain again. It's actually been a while since we've really seen that sort of nemesis for Bond done in a modern way, and in a world where businessmen are really the drivers of a political future. That feels really relevant, and you can have a lot of fun with that if you cast the right dynamic actor in that scenario. And at that point, the story just kind of tells itself. It's a classic Bond narrative packed with interesting detail that you can pull out of this story organically. There's a brief note in Moonraker that Bond spent a lot of time on the outskirts of the racing world. He attended Le Mans and saw some of the historic races there. That background can easily be employed in a car chase. There is a big, significant car chase here as part of the narrative that really draws on the flavor of that background. You can start to add in other colorful locations. Moonraker is very bound to London and its surrounding territories. After the Craig era focused very strongly on London, it makes sense to branch out a little bit, but you can very easily do that within the framework of this story. And I've often said that I'm a bigger fan of the books than I am of the films. I would really love to see this be the foundation of the next Bond film. If you read this, do sound off in the comments as to whether you agree with me. I think it's about time we got a decent Moonraker adaptation. And if you haven't read the book, I actually think Moonraker is the best place for you to start. Casino Royale is the go-to recommendation, and I can understand why, but I think if you're really just going to sit down with a Fleming novel for the first time, Moonraker is a step up from Casino Royale in the caliber of its writing and the caliber of its characterization and dialogue and detail. I can think of no better time than to read it right now as we are getting ready for Bond 26. It's the perfect time to acquaint yourself with the Ian Fleming version of the James Bond character. So thanks for watching. Let me know what you think about this video, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one.